Sorry, I'm still a little bit. Yeah. The episode I'm looking at now is the episode called Jetrel. This is an episode about the war between the Hakonians and the Talaxians and a device that a man named Jatrell invented called the Metrionic Cascade, which was used to end the war in a single day. The parallels in this to nuclear fire are both apparent and obvious, sometimes even down to the individual lines. But I don't think that's a bad thing. If I have one criticism of this episode, and I do, it is the fact that in several instances I would smooth out the dialogue, basically. There are several things that should have been left more subtle than they were. And I'll mention those as I go through. I have quite a few notes this time. You'll forgive me for my tone. I've talked before about the need, the desire to view things within a personal mindset. For example, in Mass Effect 2, this is probably my favorite example of this in fiction. Mordin has a speech where he says he is not saving the galaxy, he is saving his favorite nephew, and he explains all the reasons behind it. It is because it is difficult for any mind to think about a galaxy, about billions upon billions of people. Even when you enter into the millions or hundreds of thousands, it becomes hard to focus on an individual face in that, you know? The same theory applies to a lot of things, actually. Joys, sorrows, anger, grief. It is harder to feel something that you don't know, is really what I'm coming down to. Well, we certainly have powerful imaginations, all of us do. When it comes to something you know, because you have felt it before, because you have that correlation, because you understand, it feels more. There's a movie out there, made back in the early 80s, called The Day After. I don't know how many of... I'm actually breaking up thinking about it. I don't know how many of you out there have seen that movie. It's one of those horribly wonderful movies. The ones where I'm not even sure I want to recommend it to people. I detailed a single scene to the little one, because I was rewatching the movie recently. It came across my attention and I got transfixed. I'm not even sure I should have shared it with her. She was sobbing by the end. It is a very powerful movie precisely because it's barely fiction. That kind of thing always impacts me, personally, quite a bit. As do things about the Cold War, and the fear, and the sword of Damocles that it really was. Those sort of things get to me. This is one of the reasons, for example, Star Trek VI is my favorite Star Trek movie. While it could be argued that Star Trek II was better in terms of composition and thematic design, Star Trek VI, for me, is a superior movie because of that connection to the end of the Cold War. This episode is very much about exactly how absolutely nightmarishly horrific such things really are. And as I said, my only criticism is sometimes they do things improperly, but I do give full credit to an episode that is a Neelix episode, truly and utterly a Neelix episode, our first Neelix episode. And it is very well done. Ethan Phillips shows his chops so well, and I'll be commenting on the ways he does so as I go through this. Right at the beginning, we have a scene. Now, one other thing I am going to say. As I go through this episode, I'm going to list my changes as we go because I feel that's a better format for this one. Because all of them are just slight changes. Now, granted, I just did that back in faces, but I wanted to describe the background in one chunk because all I was changing was the background, not the episode, if you follow me. In this case, I feel more like I'm going back and revising a script for just a little bit and adding only a few little details to flesh it out a bit. So, again, I feel in this case it is better to mention them as I go. Right at the beginning of this episode, we have a scene which is actually quite well done, all things considered. The only thing I would change is I would have there be a little bit more powerful camaraderie between Tuvok and Neelix, showing the fact that this is either showing or saying that this is a game that Neelix has basically invited Tuvok to. Neelix, we don't have to see the fact that Neelix has been brought into the pool hall at this point. We can infer from the fact that Tom brought Harry there, and then Tom offered the hand to Janeway, and now, several episodes later, Neelix is already there and has just offered the hand to Tuvok, and Tuvok is now for the first time joining. I mention this because the audience can put the pieces together just fine there, that this has become something of a literal metaphor for the growing friendship amongst the crew. That's really all I would change about that. The scene is actually very well done. It's funny because it looks like a typical unnecessary Neelix scene, but everything about that scene speaks to the episode as a whole. Every single element there comes back, is part of the overall theme of this episode. I'm going to go ahead and spoil basically everything right here and now because it's going to be relevant as I go, and I'm going to mention it each time it comes up relevantly, and this is the first time, right here, first scene, within the teaser. Which, by the way, is an excellent teaser, all things considered. Neelix is afraid. He is something of a coward, or at least to some degree he is a coward. And he resists that implication, that thought. He himself does not want to acknowledge that cowardice. This is why he has never actually outgrown it. Anybody out there who's been through something where you have a severe emotional impact in some way, including cowardice, knows that unless you acknowledge and face that, in whatever way is appropriate to you, because we're all different, you never can fully get past it. You can never grow beyond it. Neelix is still a coward, and I'll talk about this more later. He denies this. He resents it. He's like, no, I'm not going to call us safety. But he does end up doing so, and he uses it as a defense, and then acts satisfied with himself for the fact that the issue of cowardice, even in such a small and relatively insignificant way, has been pushed away again. I wrote a note here which literally just says Ethan Phillips is amazing. He's the actor who plays Neelix, if you're not aware. He is actually a very good actor, and he does an amazing job with so many of the scenes in this episode. In the scene where we encounter Jetrel, he learns who Jetrel is, and he literally storms off the bridge, silent, barely even making a noise, just hampered breathing. I mention this because a lot of actors, when they're told to portray mindless rage, don't really know how to because they've never experienced it, or they don't know how to portray it. They're just not that good of actors. Ethan Phillips, in my opinion, does one of the best jobs I've seen doing that in a long time. He is quiet, and he is shaking, and he can barely make a face. He's not actually going or anything like that. It's like every muscle in his entire face has gone taut, and there's no actual expression there. He is not actually making a face. It's just everything has gone into overload. Very excellent portrayal of rage. I also have to give complete credit to James Sloyan. I do apologize if I'm pronouncing the man's name wrong. This man has only actually played 4 roles in all of Star Trek, and in each one of them is completely memorable and absolutely amazing. Those of you out there who know about Star Trek may recognize him as Admiral Jarok from TNG. He is also Mora Paul over in DS9. That's the gentleman who was Odo's father. He also played the older Alexander in Firstborn when he came back in time to alter Alexander's fate and path and all that fun stuff. Every single one of these roles is very memorable and in a very good episode or episodes. This is no exception. His portrayal of Jatrell is nothing short of phenomenal. I have a few notes as I go through here, so you'll forgive me if I just kind of skip ahead. One of the things they mention is the effect of the meteoric cascade, 300,000 dead. Now forgive me, that's one of the very few things I took exception with. I shouldn't say that. It's not like I'm like, oh, it's a terrible idea. No, no, no. From a writing perspective and from a storytelling perspective, that number should be higher. There are two reasons for this. One, something very basic and very simple. The higher the number, the bigger the artificial impact. I'll talk about this more later as to why this matters, but it should be a bigger number for that reason. And the second reason is the thing I'll get into later. But I suppose there's also a part of me that wants to get across the horror of the situation more, especially given my changes with regards to the overall plot with the Conclave. This is the first episode in which we start to see what the Conclave really is. We've seen the Terranok. They're not exactly good people. The Conclave are no better. When he when he gets off the transporter, I would have changed the entire tonality of that scene. As he gets off, he makes a comment on how, I have heard about your transporter and it's amazing. And it's very clear on repeat viewings that the transporter and its whole thing was basically the whole reason why he sought Voyager out. With regards to this episode, I would have changed that tonality as they offer to take him aboard and he beams. We don't have to show all this. They offer to beam him. He asks what's beaming. He comes over and he's like, oh my god. None of that has to be shown. None of that is relevant. He could get that off in just his general awe of, oh my goodness, that was incredible. And change the tone of the scene for reasons that'll become relevant later. Because he is just overwrought. He's like, my god, I can't believe that transporter is amazing. I would add a comment that you have no idea how much my government, I wouldn't name them just yet, how much my government would wipe away worlds just to have this device in their keeping. And, Janeway says, well, we're not in the habit of sharing our technology or something like that. And basically says, come on, let's go. And that's relevant for later. That's a little bit of foreshadowing. What's this side note? Ah, right. I'll get to that later. I made a comment here because I actually made the same comment twice because it just kept coming up. Throughout a very large portion of this story, Neelix portrays everything I talked about in the teaser very well. Ethan Phillips does an excellent job of portraying someone who is ashamed of himself, someone who is hiding the fact that he is ashamed of himself, someone who is... I don't even know how to put it properly. He is... One of the things he does constantly is when he's alone or when he doesn't think anyone's looking or whatnot, you will see on his face an expression that is powerful. It's actually almost empty. And that's kind of the point. He is just staring, and then someone will come up and he will immediately throw a mask on. He does this often. He'll make his stupid little jokes or his odd little comments, or go into a little side story, segue, kind of thing like that. And I liked that, actually. For once, I felt that was in good portrayal because it's very obvious that this is something that they were doing, that he was doing to hide. I would like to point out the failed potential of Voyager yet again. Obviously, my Neelix is very different from the show's Neelix, but even the show's Neelix up to this point was kind of irritating and kind of pointless. Up until this episode, at which point we actually see him physically, literally putting on that mask. We actually see him as I would imagine as more himself for the first time. And if that had been fully explored, if he had actually been himself from this point on and had actually grown and learned from this, that could have been awesome. A little late, but still awesome. Obviously that isn't what happened, but in my version, I wouldn't have changed much about his attitude. Maybe I would have made the jokes a little less stupid because, Neelix is supposed to be, while relatively lighthearted, nevertheless someone who's competent and a decent character. But nevertheless, I wouldn't have changed much about that. One of the things that I dislike about this episode in its overall application is the obvious counter-arguments are never used. What I mean by that is Neelix is portrayed as someone, and you could tell that they changed the writing at some point in time, because it's portrayed as though Neelix and Jatrell are both supposed to make good points, genuine, honest points that are both correct and both wrong about the war and about the usage of the cascade. But every time we have a scene like that, his counter-arguments, his verbal banter in response to Neelix is always something pathetic, really. I just developed it. It was the military and the government who decided to deploy it. That is a pathetic argument, if you'll forgive me for saying so. he could have. I'm not going to give examples because I don't feel like getting into it, but there are so many different ways he could have portrayed his case and shown his side and been defensive without going into the tepid or the pedantic, you know? And I feel like that was in the story's detriment. I mentioned before that the story this story is one of my favorites, and yet I can't put it as my favorites. One of my favorites, like say, Face. Well, actually, this story would have been one of my favorites of the whole series if they had actually portrayed this right. If Jetrel had been portrayed more neutrally, and if they had actually approached it with a little bit more subtlety. But it still stands out because there's still some excellent scenes. I'll get to that in a minute. Let's see, what do we got here? One of the things I would add, at a certain point in time, Jatrell comes in, having learned that Neelix is in fact sick with this disease, whose name I don't remember, and he says to Janeway, "I think I might have a way to cure it, and it's because of your transport." A very important point there. None of this is changes. This is actually in the episode. And then Janeway says to Chakotay, we need to do this. And Chakotay would frown and be like, that's quite a bit detour, I believe. In fact, and then I would have him pause for a second and look, at a console or something and say, that will take us quite a ways further into Conclave territory. Are you sure you want to risk that? Because while they have been traveling through the Terranok territory this whole time, this is not going through Terranok territory. This is literally sidewaying into what is fully Conclave space, because as I mentioned before, Talaxia was conquered by the Conclave proper, right? And that's a risk. That's something they've been trying to avoid doing this whole time. So, are you sure you want to do that? And Janeway would probably think about that for a moment and be like, it'll possibly save Neelix's life. So yes, I think we should. And Chakotay's like, okay. And battle readiness, that kind of thing. Just try to get across the point that this is not just a side trip they're doing, that this is something that they are considering with weight. That's the only point I want to make there. Um, there's a scene several of the scenes between Neelix and Kess are actually kind of terrible, to be a little honest with you. And I don't know why. It's so strange. Usually those scenes tend to be pretty good, especially on Kess's side of things. But in this episode, they spontaneously made Kess not good. I don't even know how better to put it. In the first scene, it's not actually Kess's fault. Rather, Neelix gives a whole thing about how the good thing that's coming about this, now that he knows that he's dying, is I won't have to live without you. I'll die before you. That's a terrible line. I don't care if you were trying to make humor out of that or not. You have failed. Congratulations, sir. That line should have been ejected entirely, especially since in my version of the Ocampa don't live for 9 years, or 8 years, or whatever the hell it is. It doesn't matter. Some ridiculous number. I would have nevertheless had I would have had that scene just re-emphasizing the point. At this point, this is actually only the third time this has happened. Actually, I believe this is the first time second time we really see the mask being put on. We see Neelix in his actual state, and he's just, and then he very clearly and visibly changes his expression, changes his entire posture and his body movement and everything, and starts putting up the mask for Kess's sake. And she could tell something's bothering him and something's wrong, and I would have her incorrectly deduce that he is simply so enraged at Jatrell, that he is so violently angry about this whole situation that he just is trying to hide that, and Neelix would just be like, kind of go with it, because he still doesn't want to admit it, right? Now, to spoil a little bit, Jatrell is trying to use the transporter technology, which is something they don't have in general in the Delta Quadrant, actually, except for like the Borg, basically. Although believe the Lorerunner did too. Well, that's later, of course. He wanted to use the transporter technology as basically the crucial element in order to try this really radical and very volatile idea of trying to recombine all of the people that he annihilated on this planet. And this is something that has been his life's obsession, I would make it very obvious, especially towards the end of the episode, that Jetrel is truly consumed with this thought. His line about, my science is not necessarily just to destroy, but we can use to help as well. Please let me do this. I would have re-emphasized that point over and over again. Make it very clear that this man has gone more than a little mad and is genuinely desperate. But when I say mad, I don't mean insane. I don't mean that he is crazy. I mean that he is just obsessed to the point of fixated on this point, as is obvious by the fact that he's dying within a matter of days, and he's still pushing for this. Now, you may be asking, well, okay, there's something I would change, and this is an important change for the overall structure of this show. I would make it so that Neelix actually did have the disease, and the doctor was actually working on a cure along with Jetrel, and that was his original intent on coming aboard. That of the stories he heard, what he had heard is their incredible medical care, and it was his hope that they could devise an actual cure for this disease and then share it with the survivors. That was his whole plan from the beginning. He obviously that may sound in contrast because of his fixation on healing these people, but that's not my point. My point is, this is his thoughts on healing people. He was thinking small term because he had to. Then he gets transported on board. Then he sees what this technology is, and he starts analyzing, and he starts looking at it, and then his mind starts going an overclock mind. Rather than being able to help some of the survivors who have this disease, he could theoretically help all the people he killed. And at that point, he starts going into just overdrive, and he starts working on this plan full tilt. He doesn't even sleep because he can't. He can't afford to. With such an immense possibility that he never even thought was potentially available ever before, right in his grasp. The thought of turning away at this point or doing anything else is simply alien at that point. You follow me? And so, for those of you who are wondering, yes, I would have them figure out this cure to the disease, and it probably would involve transporting up some of the samples from the planet and figuring out a way in order to use them to do some technobabble thing. I don't know. The details don't even necessarily matter. The point is, with his science and knowledge about the disease and the cascade itself and the effects thereof, and the doctor's obvious expertise, they do actually form a cure for this. Not in time to save Jatrell himself, I might add. Let's see here. I'll get to that later. I suppose I could actually go into this now, because all these things are going to mention something, and there's a scene I'm building up to. The scene of this whole episode. Let's go into a little bit of backstory about why. There's a scene where Neelix and Jetrel are talking alone. The doctor has turned himself off, and the two are discussing things. And I would have a little bit of exposition woven into their dialogue as they're going. I'll mention some examples later, but let me tell you what happened here, okay? The Conclave was in the middle of... Okay, let me rewind a bit here. Hakonia and Talaxia were at war. Now, one thing I want to be very clear is that Talaxia started it. Neelix himself says that he didn't feel it was a just war, that he didn't feel it was worth killing over. And there are several hints that this was the direction the episode was going to go in, that it was much more morally ambiguous, that Talaxia was not the obvious victim/good guys in the case, but rather that they were simply another organization fighting against another organization, right? I would much more go into that. I would actually have the point made that nobody actually knew who started the war after a certain point, or why, I should say. At a certain point in time, it just kind of stopped mattering. Not because it's been that long. I mean, granted, a 10-year war is quite long, all things considered, especially in science fiction, but it simply was so unimportant, whatever caused the first shot, that nobody bothered to record the event, basically, that kind of thing. And Talaxia was the aggressor, and most people either know or believe that. Now, Hakonia was losing, okay? So, the obvious happened. Hakonia turned to the Conclave, who had, for the last several years, basically been saying, "We're right here if you need us," and just sitting there waiting. And if I were doing this in full detail, I would probably say that the Conclave was subvertly helping Talaxia, specifically to weaken Hakonia, so Hakonia would do what they would do, which is to say, go to the Conclave and say, "Please save us," and Conclave would basically say, "Our terms are, you are now a member of the Conclave. There is no Hakonia anymore. There is no, whatever the heck, the Haconian order anymore. You are now a member state of the Conclave," which they would agree to. And then they would take several of their scientists, including our good friend Jetrel, and say, "We have been working on something that we've been wanting to develop for a long time. We happen to know you're very far along on this. Make it work." In case you're missing the point here, the Conclave conquered Hakonia for Jetrel. They knew he was working on this metrionic cascade, the science fiction equivalent of a nuclear weapon, a planet killer. They wanted it. Now, they could have just kidnapped him or forced him to work for them or whatever, but no. The Conclave thinks long term. We're going to conquer Hakonia anyways. Why not just go ahead and force them into this? And in so doing, they also weakened Talaxia, who they then conquered with this method. with two potential enemies now becoming subservient states and members of the Conclave, and having a new panic killer in their possession, there's really no downside to this plan from their perspective, if you follow me. And this is one of the reasons why I say the Conclave are not good people, if you follow my logic here. All of this is distant, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I'll get to the big point in a little bit. I just want to keep going out of the background really quick. So they forced him, and I do mean forced him, to finish work on this metrionic cascade. I want to make it clear that Jetrel was doing this as a source of energy, that he wasn't trying to make a weapon out of it. He was trying to build a new renewable energy source, okay? And it would not be very hard to turn this into something as a weapon. I mean, hey, we have nuclear power now, you know, that is actually a rather relatively safe and effective means of energy production here in the real life. So this is not particularly much of a stretch. So they force him to build this weapon, threatening his family, threatening his whole people. You know, you have to make this. We will do terrible, terrible things to everyone you know unless you do. And so Jatrell, under tremendous pressure, which just occurred to me as kind of a recurring theme with this guy's characters now that it occurs to me, does succeed in making the cascade. His line about, you know, yes, I knew, my wife was right, I was a monster. The moment I saw the first tests firing, I knew. Because he realizes that even though he was doing what he could under the circumstances, and indeed if he didn't, things probably would have been worse for everyone involved, to be a little bit blunt about it, he still is, in his own mind, a monster. In other words, if you're following me here, Jetrel has the exact same emotional mindset that Neelix does. That he is tremendously guilt-ridden, that he is ashamed of himself, and he tries to hide behind it, but he fails. He doesn't do nearly well as Neelix does. Neelix has been trying to keep up this facade of normalcy for too long. Jetrel has simply given in to his own despair, and the fact that he is sick with a disease that is killing him, in his mind, is actually fitting. The only reason he doesn't like that is he wants to do something, anything, to try and make up for the horrible things that he was forced to do. So he concocts this plan to try and use the incredible medical technology of the Voyager crew in order to do all this blah, 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 blah. And then finds out that he might be able to undo all the damage the Conclave done, and maybe be able to share that knowledge with anyone else, because, by the way, this is not the only time the Conclave have dropped the bomb. They have used this planet killer more than once. That's why they wanted it. Everything I've been talking about has been distant. I've been doing that very much on purpose. Because it's hard to look at a number. This is the whole theme. I've been talking about this before. It's hard to look at a number and really comprehend it. It's hard to look at 2 million casualties and think about what that means. During the scene where they... Oh, I'm sorry. There is one other thing I need to add because I just read it here. During the scene where Neelix and Jetrel are talking one by one and alone, and a lot of the exposition I just shared gets across. And Neelix is probably aware of a lot of this, by the way. At least a decent portion of it, because he knows how things went down, and there's a reason he keeps warning the crew away from the Conclave space. But this is when they learn that Jetrel was basically forced to do this. This is when Neelix learns this. This is also... Something that also comes up is that the Conclave goes out of their way to praise Jetrel for his development of this weapon, that he becomes the face for it. Yes, there was a whole team working on it. Yes, there were dozens upon dozens of scientists and workers all combining efforts, and because that's how it works. But the Edison, to use a rather bad... Actually, that's a rather good example when you think about it. The Edison, the Thomas Edison of this particular thing. And I say that's a good example because Thomas Edison tended to have credit for a lot of things he shouldn't. Which is exactly my point. Jetrel is the name and the face put on the metrionic cascade. Whenever the Conclave used it to end the war against Talaxia and to subjugate any other races, it was Jetrel's name that was mentioned. It was Jetrel that was either literally or figuratively blamed for the incident because he's the one who built the metrionic cascade. He was the sole figure. We see this in real life all the time. When a team of people are involved in something and one person just kind of tends to be the face, you know? Jetrel was the face of this thing. And he mentioned this, and this is also when we learn that the Conclave has deployed this weapon more than once. There is one single scene that I wouldn't change at all, and this is what I've been building up to, apologies, and that is Neelix's recounting of when he went back to the colony after the bomb had settled and he was trying to look for survivors. Ethan Phillips and the guy who's James Sloyan both do that scene perfectly. I'm not even sure I would change a single word in the usage of that entire scene. Neelix's obvious raw emotion. Can't even describe it as any given emotion. It is simply raw emotion. The visual terms used to describe it, the specific words, the adjectives they use, are all basically perfect. The reaction Jatrell has to the point where he turns away because he doesn't want to hear anymore. He can't bear to hear anymore. All culminating in that simple concept that I have been telling you about. A little girl named Palaxia. It's hard to look at a number of 2 million people and say, that's a tragedy. But when we have a little girl with a name and a face, the tragedy becomes a lot more real. And this is probably the single strongest element of this show, this episode, this storyline, is the personal viewpoint that Neelix recounts, torturing himself as he does so because it is so unbearable to repeat. So that we can know just how horrible this incident really was. It wasn't just some figures that we've been getting this whole episode. This whole time we've been hearing about how horrible this thing was distantly. Numbers and events. But his recounting of that is very personal and very powerful. And I wouldn't change that at all. Immediately after this, we have a dream sequence. I would only do one change to this. I would remove the music. I think it would actually be much creepier in silence. I do think that... Okay. Usually I don't like dream sequences. Especially in Star Trek. But this dream sequence, while it is a little bit overt, nevertheless is very well done. Everything that I've been talking about Neelix's character and Jatrell's character and the overall events thereof play out, symbolized within this dream. It is a little bit blunt, but I like that because Neelix himself is still struggling with his own grief on this matter. And we're still building up to the second powerful scene, which unfortunately I would change a lot of because the dialogue doesn't work nearly as well as it should in my opinion, but moving on. So I wouldn't change that scene. I do like the hiding he does. He's afraid, he hides, he redirects his rage, and then there's a moment of realization that he's woken up. Very well done. There is a scene right after this where Neelix is literally crouched up against a thing, hiding in the dark in his kitchen, and this scene could have been even more powerful than the previous one, because this is when Neelix lays it all out bare, or at least that's what should happen. What instead happens in the actual episode is Kess kind of spoon feeds him through the process of understanding himself, while she herself tries to defend him when she shouldn't, if you don't understand my meaning. To explain a little bit what I mean by that shouldn't part, if you have done something horrible or wrong, something you feel guilty for, it is a natural reaction for someone who cares about you to tell you it's okay or it's not your fault, or try to find some way to reasonably talk you into a point where you're not feeling so guilt-ridden about it, okay? But there are some times, in my opinion, I do have to stress this is an opinion, not a fact, when it would be better simply to provide comfort. Not, it's not your fault. Not try to assuage them by logic or faulty logic or anything like that. Simply tell them or show them that you care. No more and no less. Imagine how much more powerful this scene would be if Neelix goes through his wonderful, beautiful monologue about how, and even in it, he starts lying again. He starts hiding again. I thought it was an unjust war, and we could get that exposition about the Talaxians starting the war here, and he could have an offhand line about how, we don't even know why anymore. It didn't even matter. We were just fighting because we had been for so long, and I didn't like that, and blah, blah, blah. But then he catches himself, and Ethan Phillips does this beautifully. He actually does this in the episode. He catches himself, and he says, but the truth is that I was just a coward. That's really what it comes down to. And his horrible realization as he truly stares in the face of himself. And then he just kind of keeps going. anybody out there who's been in a situation where you've truly had a revelation moment like that stuff, or for lack of a better term, an exposition moment about yourself, you tend to just kind of keep going until there's nothing left. And I would have loved for Neelix, rather than to have the conversation between the two, Neelix just keeps talking about how all his rage and all his pent-up fury has been directed at himself for so long because of how guilty he feels. He lived because he refused to report for duty. He lived because he ran and hid. And so much that he's done all these years since has been trying to make up for that fact, and he's never actually overcome it. He's never actually let go of it because he still insists he's not a coward. He still insists that he didn't run and hide, even though he knows he did. And that dichotomy, that contrast, that clash, that conflict within himself has been driving his character this whole time, because he wants so desperately not to be a coward, and he doesn't know how to be, and he wants so desperately to help people and to try and make up for it, you know? And rather than the really kind of tepid scene that the two of them had, I would have had Kess just wrap an arm around him and rest her head on us. And maybe have him keep talking for a little bit after that, really start to go into the details and whatnot, talking about the horrible things he'd seen and that kind of thing. And how, even to this day, he still feels like he's there hiding in that hole that he had dug, trying not to be found by his own military, because he didn't want to go out and fight and die. There's an episode in DS9 that explores this kind of cowardice in a very similar way to the way I would have it done. It's called It's Only a Paper Moon, and it's about Nog, of all people, which is one of the reasons I love DS9. Not Nog himself, I mean the fact that they took a C-list cast member and made an episode about him. That's the general direction I'm going with here, if you understand me. For those of you who have seen that episode, that's the general tone I would go with Neelix's overall recommendation. I don't want to go back to my life. I don't want to do any of this. And he has been holding, unlike Nog, who this happened a few weeks ago, no offense to him, I mean, they were in the middle of a war, but Neelix has been dealing with those same feelings, and Neelix has been hiding on the holodeck for the last 15 years. Nobody came and helped him out. Nobody tried to pull him out of that or force him to. He didn't have a Vic Fontaine, or whatever his name was. He didn't have the other crew members trying to help him out. He was hiding on this holodeck for 15 years, and he's only now trying to come to real terms with that fact and trying to step back out into his real life, That's what I'm going with here. Towards the end, towards the end, there's a scene where we get the reveal that he's trying to reconstruct all these people and blah blah blah, and how he's been working on it this whole time. I would change very little about that scene. There's a line I mentioned here, and I don't remember what point at which I wanted to add it in, so forgive me. I actually wrote down the line, "You sound like the Conclave," and it was intended to be a very powerful insult, something that was just spitting in the face of whoever he said it to. And I believe it was Neelix was going to say it to Jetrel when Jetrel was talking about, the science and the science progressing on thing. I could be wrong, but in any case, that scene is beautiful for one very simple reason. One, it's a great way to show Jetrel's obsession, his fixation over fixing this, and his incredible guilt and everything that he's been feeling that I've been mentioning over on Neelix's side, that he is also feeling. And further, during that scene, Neelix does a remarkable thing. Or rather, Ethan Phillips does a remarkable thing with his character. He starts out enraged. He moves from rage to a degree of cautious, like curiosity, towards genuine hope, towards, oh my God, this is actually going to work, He goes through that whole gamut throughout this scene, and it is Neelix, and this is very important, I would definitely keep this, it is Neelix who argues that they should try this experiment, that they should try to help these people, begs Janeway, I know it's unlikely, I know it's going to be a tremendous power concern, I know we're in the middle of Conclave space, please, Captain, I am begging you, help him to try and save these people, and so they go ahead and do it, and it doesn't work. I wouldn't change that at all, unfortunately. I've thought about that many times, but sometimes from a writing perspective, from a thematics perspective, it doesn't work out. And I would not change that at all, unfortunately. And I would have Jatrell curl up. This is a minor change. Rather than going, I would just have him kind of fall to his knees and slowly just kind of curl up like this, and then fall over unconscious. And then they realize, oh God, get him to the thing. And at the very end, at the very end, I like the fact that Neelix, the very last thing Jatrell heard was that Neelix forgave him. That was actually quite well done, in my opinion. I actually thought about adding a line there. I've decided not to. I don't think I would. I think it works very well as is. And I don't think there's any need to add anything else to this whole thing. Everything that needs to be said in this episode has been said. Very good episode. Very amazing episode. I enjoyed it then. I enjoyed it even more now. And I do not deny that I was actually in tears at several points during this episode. Excellently done. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take a bit of a break because the next episode after this is one I absolutely hate. So I'll talk to you guys later.